What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and I'm going to give you my updated college football playoff predictions heading into Week 11, and they have changed. I made several changes to the playoff predictions, and obviously Notre Dame beating Clemson was a big story this past weekend, especially when you look at the playoff picture. And it really is starting to set up to where we could potentially, if Clemson beats Notre Dame in a rematch, we could potentially be looking at a very tight race for number 4. A very controversial race, I'm sure. I'm sure there will be arguments all over the place if things go the way they could possibly go. And it's starting to look like, we might see, again, if Notre Dame beats Clemson, then Clemson's out. And then maybe that makes it easier to pick the number 4 team. But let's say Clemson does beat Notre Dame. Then you'll have a one-loss Notre Dame, potentially a one-loss Texas A&M, potentially a one-loss Oklahoma State, potentially an undefeated BYU, an undefeated Cincinnati, maybe an undefeated Liberty. You will have possibly an undefeated Pac-12 team, USC or Oregon. I mean, I don't know how the committee is going to do it if it does play out like that, but we're still a long ways away. There'll probably be upsets throughout the rest of the season, and it might at the end of the year actually be really clear, but I don't know that it's going to be, especially this year. So, new at number 1, we have Alabama, Ohio State at number 2. I don't remember if I moved Alabama last week or not. I think I might have kept Clemson at number 1, but Alabama, I think, now goes to number 1. I think they will go undefeated. Okay, we're talking about the chaos scenarios. How about if Florida beats Alabama in the SEC championship? Throw another one in there. And, if that happens, I feel like if Clemson and Florida win in the conference championship games, I think that actually makes it pretty clear. It will be Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, and Florida. Not in that order, but those would be the 4 teams. I just think Florida will have enough or obviously Florida will be in because they would have won the SEC. I think Alabama will have enough on their resume. A win over Texas A&M, a win over Georgia, and just I think the perception that they are one of the best 4 teams. So I think if it played out like that, you would see those 4 teams getting in. But I'm picking Alabama to beat Florida. So I've got the tied at number 1. I think Ohio State is also going to go undefeated. I have them at number 2. I am predicting Clemson to beat Notre Dame in the rematch. So I've got Clemson at number 3. I think when you look at a potentially healthy defense for the Tigers, Trevor Lawrence back, a neutral field, I think there are a lot of things pointing towards Clemson winning a rematch. But who knows? Maybe Clemson's not healthy on defense. Maybe Trevor Lawrence gets banged up. Even if I don't think Trevor Lawrence was really the reason that they lost the game to Notre Dame. I think if he had been in there, they might still have lost. I think it was more about the defense. I think they're really missing some of those guys, especially James Skalski, the leader of that defense. Plus, they made a lot of mistakes early, had some turnovers, and just dug themselves into a pretty big hole. I think if some of those things don't happen, plus playing on a neutral field with a healthy defense, again, I think Clemson will win that game. So then you have to look at it. Maybe Notre Dame would get the number 4 spot because they would have that one win over Clemson. You also have to look at Texas A&M. I think those are 2 teams that definitely have a shot at the number 4 spot if both teams do win out and Notre Dame only loses that game to Clemson. When you're comparing those resumes, Notre Dame would have a win over Clemson. Texas A&M would have one over Florida. Look at the losses. A&M would have a loss to Alabama. Notre Dame would have a loss to Clemson. If Notre Dame plays Clemson tight, if it's a close game in the rematch but they lose, I think that's better than Texas A&M's loss to Alabama. But at the same time, the committee may look at the first Clemson matchup and say, well, Clemson wasn't 100% and not give Notre Dame as much credit for winning that game. So many different ways to look at this if it does come down to those 2 teams. I really don't know what the committee would do. I think it would really come down to how close Notre Dame plays Clemson in that rematch. I think if Notre Dame plays Clemson really close, Notre Dame would be in. If they lose by 20, I think Texas A&M would probably be in that scenario. And we're not even talking about other teams like Pac-12 champion, potentially undefeated, or some other teams that might get in there. Oklahoma State with 1 loss if they win the Big 12. So there are a lot of different scenarios there. And I look at the path for both of those teams. Notre Dame, they've got a couple of tricky games. Boston College this week and also North Carolina. I know North Carolina hasn't played great this year, especially on defense, but they've still got a high-powered offense, and they are capable of winning a big game, in my opinion. So maybe Notre Dame doesn't even make it to that Clemson game undefeated, and then it becomes a little bit more clear. But I'm actually going to go with someone else. I'm not going to go with A&M or Notre Dame. It's a team that continues to just impress me. They continue to blow teams out. I'm looking at the schedule. I don't really see anyone beating them. I've kind of changed my mind on this team. I'm going with Cincinnati. I believe Cincinnati will run the table. They will go undefeated, and the Bearcats will make it into the college football playoff. You'll look at their resume. They'll have potentially 2 wins over SMU, and maybe those are the only losses SMU has this season. That'll be great for Cincinnati. You've got some quality teams in the American: Tulsa, the UCF, Memphis, Houston. I mean, these are teams that probably won't finish in the top 25. Maybe one of them does. But they're still quality teams. They're still pretty good teams. And I think that's going to be enough because of the way Cincinnati has been winning these games. They've been blowing teams out. If their games have been close, I don't think that the committee would really consider them. But if you look at the way that they've played and just how they look, they passed the eye test. A lot going for this Cincinnati team. And if they run the table, I think the committee might just put them in there. You compare, for example, their win over Houston and BYU's win over Houston. The Cincinnati win over Houston was a much more convincing win than the BYU game. The BYU-Houston game was close throughout most of the game. Cincinnati dominated from start to finish. So when you're comparing those two teams again, it makes Cincinnati look really, really good. BYU, I think, might go undefeated. Probably will go undefeated, but they're not going to have the resume. Also, don't forget Army. Cincinnati beat Army by a couple of scores. Army only has 1 loss right now. If they continue to win, they could be a top 25 team. So I think there's enough on the resume. They passed the eye test. They've been beating teams by a lot. I think the committee might put Cincinnati in if they go undefeated and this scenario plays out. But I don't think they will have a chance against Alabama. Bama rolls. They move on to the national championship game. And I don't really know any team that you put at number 4 that's going to challenge the Tide. Notre Dame, Florida, maybe. Florida's not going to be there, obviously, because they'll have to beat Alabama. And if they do, that would change the order here. But Notre Dame, I don't know that Texas A&M is really going to play them all that tough. They didn't the first time. I don't know. It's tough to see anyone in that number 4 spot really challenging Alabama. And I've made this prediction several times. We talked about Ohio State, Clemson. It seems like no matter how you look at this, some way I've got these two teams meeting in the playoff. And I've talked about it again in previous weeks. I think Ohio State will win that game. Although I'm starting to think it's kind of tough. You know, Ohio State's not looking as good as I thought they would in certain areas. They're not running the football as well as I thought they would. But at the same time, Clemson on defense not playing at the level that I think they're capable of playing. It's tough to say who would win that game right now. Both teams have kind of been up and down so far this season. So we get to Alabama versus Ohio State. You go back to my original prediction that never even happened because I didn't make the video, but I told you guys I had Ohio State winning the national championship. And then the Big Ten canceled their season or postponed. And preseason, right before the season, when I did my playoff prediction that did not include Ohio State, did not include the Big Ten, I picked Alabama to win. Why did I pick Alabama? I said, with everything going on, with the disruptions in the offseason and during the season, who do I trust the most in that scenario? It's Nick Saban. I think Nick Saban is the psychological master when it comes to college football. And because of that, and because these disruptions just continue, and also because of Alabama's ability to run the football, Ohio State has not been able to do that. Alabama's defense, I think, might wind up being a little bit stronger than Ohio State's as well. And Alabama's passing game has been just great. I know Ohio State's is probably the best in the country, but Alabama's has been really good as well. I just think that there is enough there to make me change my pick back to that team, back to Alabama. I'm going with the Crimson Tide to win the national championship. As much as it pains me to say that, obviously you guys know I'm an Auburn fan, and I don't want to see Alabama win a national championship, but I think they're going to. I feel like this is the team that's going to do it. If it was a normal year, I think I would probably stick with Ohio State, but you know, they're not playing again this weekend. You know, how are they going to get into rhythm and get better when they're not playing as many games? I just trust Nick Saban. I think Alabama will win the national championship. I have changed my pick back to the Crimson Tide, and here are the other teams. So this is the order that I think when I'm just going through this in my head and I'm trying to pick that number 4 team. I think Notre Dame probably gets in over Texas A&M if that scenario plays out where both teams have 1 loss. And I don't think, I've talked about this before, Notre Dame will be in the top 4 if they go undefeated. Texas A&M will be behind Notre Dame. If Notre Dame loses to Clemson, Texas A&M does not play on championship weekend. I do not see how you can move to A&M ahead of Notre Dame when they didn't play. Why would you reward them for not playing and punish Notre Dame for playing in a conference championship game? So I think Notre Dame would be the team if it plays out that way, but Texas A&M is right behind them if Notre Dame were to lose. And again, I think Cincinnati might have to lose a game for one of these teams to get in, unless, again, Notre Dame could run the table. They could beat Clemson in a rematch, and then they're in, obviously. But I'm going with Clemson, my personal prediction. Florida, I think it might have a chance against Alabama. They'll score points in that game, so you never know. And I think they're right there at number 3 if they're able to win that game. Oklahoma State and Miami are 2 wild cards. Even if they win out, I don't know if it's going to be enough. The Big 12 is down, so that hurts Oklahoma State. Miami, their path may wind up being to where they don't even play in the ACC championship, but they finish with that one loss. I don't know how it's going to play out for the Hurricanes. I just don't know if their resume is going to be there. Oregon, USC, if one of those teams goes undefeated, I still think they're behind these other teams just because the Pac-12 is not going to be very good this year, and they're not going to play that many games. BYU and Liberty, I don't really think they have a chance, but if we just get a ton of chaos, Notre Dame loses to Boston College in North Carolina, Texas A&M loses to Auburn, Florida loses to Alabama, which I think will happen. Oklahoma State loses a couple of games. Miami loses another game. Oregon, USC, neither one of them go undefeated. Maybe there's a way for BYU or Liberty to get in there. Liberty will actually have a decent resume. Went over Virginia Tech. They still have NC State. They beat Syracuse in a blowout. They'll also have potentially an undefeated Coastal Carolina, so they'll have the better resume. That'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And then there's Texas and Oklahoma. I continue to talk about this. If one of these teams wins the Big 12, they would have 2 losses, but they'd be a conference champion, and they'd be playing with a lot of momentum because their losses came early in the season. And if we get a ton of chaos, it's going to take a lot, but if we get a ton of chaos, we could potentially see one of these 2 teams win the Big 12 and make it into the college football playoff. So those are my updated predictions. I'd love to know what you guys think about it. Give me your comments down below. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football Channel.